Hello, I'm Dave Stotts. Welcome to the Birth of Freedom DVD series. Did you know that the opponents of Christianity have for centuries controlled the very terms by which we understand the history of Christianity? Their little 30-second history lesson goes a little bit like this. Ancient Rome and Greece were splendid. Then along came Christianity, which hobbled the Roman Empire, snuffed out scientific progress, and flung everybody into the Dark Ages. Civilization was on life support for 1,000 years until the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning and civilization. Then a couple of hundred years went by, and finally the pall of irrational faith was finally lifted with the dawning of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. This little 30-second history lesson is pithy, memorable, and completely false. Most academic historians who study these periods have rejected the whole Dark Ages boilerplate a long time ago, and yet it still lingers in our culture. Do you see the problem? Many people don't even give Christianity a hearing because they think, why would I want a religion that's basically messed things up for 1,000 years? The Bible says we should always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's in us. Well, one way we can do that is to see that Christianity has been the greatest force for liberation and progress in human history. Now, we're about to embark on a journey through the long, dramatic story of the West. 7 lessons, 70 minutes, 2,500 years of history. But I should warn you, we will encounter many people behaving badly, even Christians. The fall of man happened. Human nature isn't always pretty. But still, through it all, we will witness the Word of God beckoning civilization toward that great ideal now enshrined in the American Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The American founders said that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They called this a self-evident truth. 87 years later, Abraham Lincoln reaffirmed this idea on the Civil War battlefield of Gettysburg. And in 1963, these same words echoed from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as Martin Luther King Jr. urged America to fulfill the promise of its founding. But humans are separated by enormous differences in talent and circumstance. Why would anyone believe that all men are created equal? That all should be free? That all deserve a voice in choosing their leaders? Why would any nation consider this a self-evident truth?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For the millions around the world who have never tasted liberty, the question cries for an answer. How is freedom born? Babylon, Egypt, China, India, Greece, Rome. all the great empires of the ancient world rejected the idea of human equality. Even the great philosophers of ancient Athens maintained that humans are created most unequally, some to rule, others to serve.
Plato said people outside the Greek world, they're barbarians. They're not really as good or as human as the rest of us, so therefore they're worthy of being slaves. Aristotle said that slaves were slaves because they were incapable of self-responsibility, incapable of self-government. And in fact, this was the argument used to justify slavery for centuries onwards.
Greek power reached its zenith under Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Meanwhile, another power was emerging in the West, the Republic of Rome.
The entire Roman economy was built on slave labor. If you were born a slave, your average lifespan in Rome was about 20 years, and they were just simply worked to death. Roman civilization, despite all its glitz and glimmer and the great achievements that they made, had a very low view of human life and the value of human life. One example comes from an unimportant businessman by the name of Hilarion, who was on a trip to Alexandria and wrote a letter home to his wife.
Hilarion to Alice, his wife. Heartiest greetings. I beg and beseech of you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive wages, I will send them to you. If, good luck to you, you have a child. If it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, throw it out. You told Aphrodisias to tell me, do not forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you, therefore, not to worry.
Hilarion expresses his love for his wife, tenderness, compassion toward her, toward his son, which is the little child, and yet a complete disregard for the life of a daughter. Throw it out. Hilarion is a very good representative sample of the Roman view of human life.
Rome's power endured for almost 1,000 years. But in the 5th century AD, German tribes crossed the Rhine and eventually overthrew the city of Rome. So began the Middle Ages. For a time, Western civilization seemed to be dying. This was nowhere clearer than in the life of Cassiodorus. The Roman nobleman dreamed of founding an institution among the ruins of the fallen empire, a center of learning to preserve the best that had been thought and said. Another war forced him to flee, and when he returned years later, he built a monastery. There, as an old man, he finished his last work. It wasn't, however, an anthology of great writings. It was a spelling book. The reason was simple. His monks, the most learned men in the land, could no longer read the great books in their own library. It was an inauspicious time, and yet it marked the beginning of a civilization that would change the world.
With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Italy lay in ruin. But one of the great ironies of history of this particular period, one of the great comic reversals, is that this little band of monks, and not just this particular band, but monks all through Western Europe, not only did they engage in this civilizational enterprise of recapturing and reclaiming what had been lost from the classical period, they also went on, together with the inventors and the merchants and the lawyers of the Middle Ages, to go forward and build a culture that was going to surpass anything that had existed before it.
It was in these dark ages that a strange idea began slowly to take hold, the idea of human equality.
If we look at textbooks that cover this period, one of the interesting things is that we see the word slave disappear. It's almost as if it just vanishes into thin air and is replaced by the word serf or peasant.
Some people say, oh yeah, well they just changed the name from slave to serf. But that's a lie. Serfs were not free by our standards, but compared to slaves, they were very free. They could marry who they wanted to, they owed days of work, but they basically were in control of their own hours. No, it wasn't complete freedom, but it was very different from chattel slavery.
Masters still misused their servants, and yet in the winding course of the Middle Ages, the status of European peasants rose far above the status of slaves under the Roman Empire.
There's a growing sense of property rights, of rights to liberty. And as the Middle Ages goes forward, serfdom goes into decline. There were very few serfs left in Europe. By the 15th century, 16th century, serfdom is virtually eliminated.
Well, slavery was gotten rid of in Europe. That's a story about slavery that is very seldom told, and it's a shame. Because what we can say about slavery is that until 700, 800, 900 in Europe, is it was universal. Everybody had slavery. Heck, there were many tribes of Indians, pre-Columbian Indians in North America who had slaves. All of the Northwest Indians along the Pacific were slave societies. Slavery was the rule. Christian Europe got rid of slavery.
He had returned to his hometown synagogue, and they handed him a scroll of Isaiah. Opening it, he read from a passage near the end of the book, a prophecy of the coming Messiah. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed. Now, we understand that Jesus was referring to spiritual liberation. The Messiah came to set his people free from the chains of sin. What we forget is that spiritual liberation led to physical liberation, to healing, to comforting the afflicted and the outcast. The incarnate Word entered human history and in the most tangible of ways set the captives free.
We human beings, we strange beings, we will do many things unthinkingly in our lives. And someone is likely to describe some of those things as freedom. But if they do so, they'll be making a mistake. The things that we do unthinkingly, we do not do freely, even if there's no impediment to our doing them. When we say that we have no impediments to doing what we do, and we describe that as freedom, we're actually describing nothing very different from the ball that rolls down a hill without a stone being in its path. There's no glory in that, no credit for it. It's just something that happens to it. We aren't concerned with whether there are impediments to our action. We're concerned whether we can choose our action. So when I spoke of Frederick Douglass going towards something when he escaped slavery, I meant he was trying to place himself in the situation where the fullest possible effect of his own choices could be realized, where he could choose the purposes and move toward them deliberately. Now that's what freedom is about. But it means not choosing just any purpose, because human beings are certain kinds of beings. Therefore, they have appropriate purposes. Let me put it this way. Why would anyone consider it freedom for a human being to choose to do an inhuman thing? That's not a freedom. That is irresponsibility. You can call it any number of things, but it's not freedom.
I can be free in the sense that I play a musical instrument without any training, without any instruction, without any learning, but essentially that amounts to me just banging away on the piano or rubbing away on the violin without making any beautiful music. Instead, all I get is noise and static. On the other hand, however, if I train myself, if I discipline myself, if I am humble enough to submit myself to the guidance of those who are wiser than me, then I can learn to begin to play the piano. I can learn to begin to play music that others have written. I can even learn to begin to compose my own music. In other words, I can create something beautiful with this freedom. But that's freedom for excellence. It's not freedom in the sense that I can just choose whatever I want arbitrarily and willy-nilly. What it's about is choosing what makes us better as human beings, which means having an appreciation of the truth about ourselves and the truth about the way that the world has been made. Of course, it's possible for societies that value liberty to basically reduce freedom to what we call freedom of indifference, in the sense that none of my choices matter. One choice is just as good as another choice. Drug use is just as good as viewing beautiful art in a Parisian museum. There's a decisive difference between the two. But if we view these things as being essentially the same, that there is no difference in the way that we make our choices, that there is no difference in the essential ends that we choose with our freedom, then not only do I think we start to become slaves of our own passions and slaves of popular opinion and slaves of whatever a particular arbitrary majority happen to want at a particular point in time, but perhaps more worryingly and more fundamentally, we start to erode slowly but surely the foundations of the civilization that makes our freedom possible. When we think about the history of Christianity, we of course see some very bad things. We see Christians not living up to what the Christian gospel demands of its adherents. So, we see people who engage in Machiavellian behaviour, we see treachery, we see betrayal, we see people stealing, killing, etc., etc., etc. But what's interesting is the very fact that Christians can write this own history about themselves. Because if we compare that to the types of histories that were often written in the ancient world and in the pre-Christian world, such as the histories and the biographies of someone like Alexander the Great, we see these great eulogies, these great stories of how these people had done all these wonderful things, and yes, one might be critical here and there, but basically there is this very self-affirming understanding of the lives of the great peoples of these times. But when we compare that, for example, to the Hebrew Scriptures, what we see is this deeply self-critical history. Even the greatest kings of Israel, such as David, for example, and his son Solomon, what we find there is that despite these wonderful stories that are present about them in the Hebrew Scriptures, we also find this deeply critical analysis of their behavior, their actions, their choices. We see them being rebuked by prophets of the Old Testament. So this is very important, because we have to remember that this type of historical self-awareness is really not very well known outside the Jewish context and outside the wider Christian context, when this tradition of understanding history and the way of writing history begins to transcend the Jewish world and permeate the rest of what we call today Western civilization. It's very common for us to talk about radical documents in Western history, but I think one of the most radical documents was a letter written in the 1st century AD from an obscure Jewish rabbi to a Roman slave owner. And the gist of the letter was this: I have your escaped slave. I'm sending him back to you. Really, he's the same as you. He's another human being. Maybe you'd like to think about freeing him.
There's a very interesting and short epistle in the New Testament, the letter to Philemon, who was a Christian man and a slave owner. His slave, Onesimus, had escaped and run away, and he finds the Apostle Paul and, interestingly, repents of his fleeing and asks the apostle, or the apostle volunteers, I'm not sure, to write a letter to his owner and to receive him back. And that's what the letter to Philemon is. What's, I guess, most interesting is that Paul commends Onesimus to his owner Philemon as an equal, as a Christian brother, even though there's this accepted economic relationship. And Paul does not really address the economic relationship directly. He addresses the human relationship.
That didn't mean they had to have the same occupation, it didn't mean that they had to have the same wealth, or even occupy the same status within the social order that had existed at the time. What is the same is their equality and dignity.
And it's this sort of Christian view of humanity, right? That there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but we're all one, we're all brothers, we're all equal before God. That is an idea that transformed Europe and transformed the world. It still does.